Good morning. It's good to see everyone that we have out this morning. We're grateful for your presence. We're glad that we have visitors here, and we're grateful for you, and we'd invite you back at any opportunity that you may have. We'll be meeting again tonight at 6:30 for another period of worship, and tonight is singing night. We will be focusing our worship on praising the Lord in song and teaching and admonishing one another in those songs, as it talks about in Colossians chapter 3 and verse 16 and Ephesians chapter 5 verses 19 and 20. We hope you can join us for that. It's something we do every first Sunday of the month. It's a great time to put into perspective why we worship the Lord and the things that we do in regard to that. I've got a couple questions for you this morning as we begin. Number one, have you ever received a gift that you didn't like? Now, I cannot lie to you this morning because I believe that my sister who's visiting and my wife would both jump up and say, "Hold on, Micah, don't you remember that family home video of you saying that all your birthday gifts were, I believe the word that I used were stinky? Stinky?" So yes, I have received a gift that at the time I didn't like. Maybe you too received a gift that you weren't a big fan of. Let me ask you this about that though. Were you still grateful? Maybe you didn't really like the gift. It didn't really fit what you wanted, but were you still grateful? The answer for me was I was made to be grateful after a spanking or two. But did you appreciate the effort and the thought that went into that gift, even if you did not maybe necessarily like the gift itself? Did you have gratitude? Let me ask you this as well, another question. Have you ever felt like, if I could just get, fill in the blank here, I could get this or I could get that, then I'll be happy? Maybe it's, if I could just get that car, then I'd be happy. Or if I could just live in my own home and don't have to rent anymore, then I'd be happy. Or if I could just make more money, or if I could just have a better career, or if I could just lose this much weight, or whatever it is, something to have or something to achieve, then I would be happy. Then I would be satisfied. Today we're talking about gratitude and contentment. And if you've ever lived in ingratitude and discontentment, then you know that that's a fragile way to live. That you're always looking for the next thing, that you're never happy with where you are, and that is just kind of a miserable, fragile way to live. Well, God calls us to a better way. And that's what I want to talk to you about this morning. It's our theme of the month. Gratitude and contentment is our theme of the month. Our yearly theme is being strengthened in the inner man. And we've been talking about month by month different types of things that are inward, inner attitudes, inner ideas. We want to be better people on the inside because we know that leads to being a better person on the outside. That leads to being truly effective in the Lord's work. And so we want to focus on these inward qualities here this morning and perhaps as we go on throughout the month. So let's first talk about gratitude. And this is not necessarily a definition of gratitude, but it is what gratitude does. Gratitude rightly responds to God's grace. And those ideas are actually tied together in the word itself. The Latin word for grace is gratia. And if I were to spell it here on the board, which I will just to let you see that. Excuse my handwriting, but gratia. You see, G-R-A-T, grati. You can just add tude on the end instead, gratitude. The idea of grace and thanksgiving are tied together in Latin, but they're also tied together in Greek. The Greek word for grace is charis. The Greek word for thanksgiving is Eucharisto. Literally, good grace. What we need to understand about gratitude, it is rightfully responding to God's grace. God has given us gifts. Of course, the greatest gift is salvation, but God has given us much more than that. And how we respond to that is gratitude, is being thankful. And that's how we should respond. So one thing that we need to understand about gratitude is gratitude sees God as the giver of all good things. God's the one who gives us what we have. In James chapter 1, if you turn over there, James chapter 1. And in verse 17, it says, "Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow." Every good thing, every perfect thing is from above. It comes from God. And over in Acts chapter 17, Paul talks about this too. In his sermon on Mars Hill, he says in verse 24, "The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things." Paul says God doesn't need anything that we can give him. He doesn't need anything that we can give him because he made everything and he's given everything to us. He's the giver of life. He's the giver of all good things. Once we understand that every single blessing, every single good thing that we have comes from God, then it also gives us this perspective as it sees life as a gift instead of something owed. Now, in our American way of thinking, we think about our rights, our human rights. And really what that concept is the idea that because I am a human, I have certain rights, I have certain things that I am owed in a sense. And I think there are some basic human rights, as it talks about in the Constitution and it talks about in other places, that those things are a gift from God, that God has endowed those things. But we need to be careful about thinking as life as something that we're owed, but rather it is a gift. If you turn over to 1 Chronicles chapter 29. 1 Chronicles chapter 29. This is David, and he's talking about the temple. He's getting the temple ready to be built. He knows that Solomon is going to build it, but David is starting to gather that wealth to do so. And he recognizes that that wealth that he's been given to build the temple is from God. Verse 13, "Now therefore, our God, we thank you and praise your glorious name. But who am I and who are my people that we should be able to offer as generously as this? For all things come from you, and from your hand we have given you." I want to take you back a few minutes in worship to what we just did in giving the offering. When this collection was taken up and we gave of our own free will money that we had earned through our jobs and other ways that we can earn money, from whose hand was that given, really? Well, you could say, well, yeah, that's my hard-earned money. I worked hard for that money, and I did this and that. That's my money. Not really. It's from God's hand that we give back to Him. Because it all comes from Him. And when you see that, it's easy to give. It's easy to have a free will offering. Because we're just giving back to God what's already His. That He's blessed us with. And we're giving a portion back. So instead of begrudgingly, I can give freely. God gave me a gift. I'm going to give a little bit back for the work of the church. It's interesting to me over in Romans chapter 8, or Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, as Paul is describing the degradation of the world. He's describing wicked people, and specifically in the context, he's talking about Gentiles and how they forgot God. I want you to notice how he puts that in verse 18, starting in verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. So right here Paul says, even if somebody is not a Jew, if they didn't grow up in the law of Moses knowing God, Paul says you can still know God. The invisible attributes of God are seen. The world around us tells us there is a God and He is to be served. You can know God of Him through His invisible attributes. And Paul says in verse 21, for even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks. And then he goes on to talk about how wicked they were. That they were, as you continue on in verse 29, being filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice, gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant. I mean, just this list of wickedness, degradation. When did it start, according to Paul? They did not honor God as God, nor did they give thanks, or nor were thankful. Gratitude, or lack thereof in this case, led to everything else. Because they did not see life as a gift from God, but rather they were more worried about glorifying themselves and what they were owed and what they wanted to do. They were not thankful to God. They did not recognize life as a gift from God, and therefore they did not honor Him and worship Him. So when we do not show the right response to God's grace, gratitude, then we are setting ourselves up for evil, for sin. But understand that gratitude, sometimes we think of that as something we feel. And certainly we should feel gratitude in our hearts. We should be grateful in our hearts to God for everything that He has given us. But gratitude is not merely a feeling, but rather gratitude moves us to worship and obey. Turn with me to Psalm 100. Psalm 100. We read this just a moment ago. It says, shout joyfully to the Lord, all the earth. Serve the Lord with gladness. Come before Him with joyful singing. So we have this worship language. But right in the center of talking about worshiping God, I want you to notice the words that are used here. Verse 3, know that the Lord Himself is God. It is He who has made us and not we ourselves. God has given us life. We are not self-sufficient, but we are reliant upon Him and His goodness. We are His people and the sheep of His pasture. And so, knowing that the Lord is God, knowing that He made us, not we ourselves, how shall we respond? Verse 4. Enter His gates with thanksgiving, with gratitude, and His courts with praise. Give thanks to Him. Bless His name. For the Lord is good, His loving kindness is everlasting, and His faithfulness to all generations. When we recognize that God is the giver of all good things, we should be entering His courts with thanksgiving and His courts with praise, giving thanks to Him, serving Him for what He has done for us, worshiping Him with gratitude in our hearts. Paul talks about this concept over in 1 Corinthians 15 as well. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 10. As he's talking about his apostleship, his call to apostleship, he says, "But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And His grace toward me did not prove vain, but I labored even more than all of them. Yet not I, but the grace of God with me." Paul recognized that Jesus had shown grace to him by appearing to him on the road to Damascus, calling him out of persecution into a life of service. Paul says, even though I was a blasphemer and all of those things, Jesus showed me grace. And I was grateful. And so I got to work. And he says, I labored even more than all of them. Truthfully, can we say, who has been a more faithful servant in God's house than Paul? He did that because he recognized the grace that had been shown to him. He is an example of rightly responding to God's grace. He was given a gift, many gifts, and he used them all in service to Jesus. So having the right perspective about all the things that we have, recognize they are given to us by God, feeling that gratitude in our heart, but then letting that emotion move us into worship and obedience. That is the right response. But let's turn the page here and talk a little bit about contentment. These two ideas are very much related to each other. Gratitude is that feeling and that action of being happy with and being grateful for what God has given us. And contentment rests in what God has provided. Contentment is the state of essentially being happy with what you have. And one thing we should note about contentment is that contentment is unnatural for us in some ways. Naturally speaking, it seems like humans, we always want more. We crave excess, even when we have enough. And if you don't think that's the case, I encourage you to watch children sometimes and how they're given everything they need, and yet they're always asking for more. In Luke chapter 3, we'll turn over there. Luke chapter 3, as John the Baptist is preaching, it says, some soldiers were questioning him, saying, "And what about us? What shall we do?" Remember, John is preparing the way for Jesus. And he's teaching them about what kind of lives they should live. So these soldiers, what about us? What shall we do? And he said to them, do not take any money from anyone by force, or accuse anyone falsely, and be content with your wages. All the things that John could have said to them, he says, don't be greedy, don't be false, be content. Be content with your wages. Interestingly enough, in the verses previously, he basically says the same thing for the tax collectors. In verse 13, collect no more than what you have been ordered to. In other words, don't be greedy yourselves. Be content with what you're being paid. Over in Hebrews chapter 13, it says, make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have, for he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. Make sure your character is free from the love of money. Be content with what you have. There are plenty of other verses in the Bible that talk about this concept, be content. And when we see a command in the Bible, it's because man tends to go the other way. Naturally, we want to be greedy. We want to have more. We're always chasing the next thing, the next big prize, whatever that may be. But the Bible says you got to fight against that. Be content. Understanding that it's unnatural, we should also understand that contentment is learned. In Philippians chapter 4, in verse 11, we're going to include verse 13. I know that's not on the PowerPoint, but we'll read that too. Philippians 4, verses 11 through 13, Paul says, not that I speak from want, for I have learned to be content in whatever circumstances I am. I know how to get along with humble means, and I also know how to live in prosperity. And in every circumstance, I have learned the secret of being filled and going hungry, both of having abundance and suffering need. I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. Paul, when he says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, or through Him who strengthens me, he's talking about being content. And Paul doesn't say, I've learned to be poor, and that's it. No, Paul says, I've also learned to be rich. Sometimes I've had abundance, sometimes I've had a lot of stuff. Sometimes I've had very little. Sometimes I've been hungry, sometimes I've been filled. But he said, my circumstances don't matter. I'm always content. Let me tell you, there's a danger in both. In both being hungry and being filled. In being filled, once we have, the tendency is to want even more. To keep just piling on and piling on. And Paul says, no, I've learned be happy with what I have then. But of course, when we're hungry, we can become envious. We can think of the things that we don't have. And we can maybe even blame God and say, where are my blessings? And Paul said, that's not how I am either. I'm content. When we talk about this idea of contentment being learned, I think about what Paul says in 1 Timothy 6. He says, godliness with contentment is great gain. In other words, if I'm righteous and holy and I'm putting emphasis on the right things, I'm not always seeking material goods, but rather I'm resting in the Lord, then I've really gained. Then I'm truly profitable. See, that's the secret to contentment. And I hope you've seen it in the verses that we've said. Remember back to Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 5. It says, make sure your character is free from the love of money, but rather be content. And then it says, for He Himself has said, I will never desert you, nor forsake you. We're not content because we've finally gotten everything that we've wanted, at least materially. We're content because we have the Lord. And that's all we need. Paul himself here shares the secret of contentment. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. I can be hungry or I can be filled. I can have prosperity. I can have nothing. It doesn't matter as long as I've got the Lord, then I'm happy. Contentment is in knowing God. In Deuteronomy chapter 8, this was something that God wanted to teach the children of Israel. And it's something that we need to be taught as well. Deuteronomy chapter 8, starting in verse 2. God says to the children of Israel, "You shall remember all the way which the Lord your God has led you in the wilderness these 40 years, that he might humble you, testing you, to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. He humbled you and let you be hungry, and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you understand that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord." If our life consists of what will we eat, what will we drink, or in language from Matthew chapter 6, if our life consists of our possessions, there's always going to be more and more. I need more. I need more food. I need more drink. I need more money. I need more toys to play with. Whatever it is. But if our life consists of God, then we can have fullness. Always. Man does not live by bread alone. Yes, we need certain things that God is the provider of. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God. God can fill us up in ways that nothing else can. In Psalm 23, Psalm 23, one of the most famous passages in the entire Bible. And in verse 1, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The idea of "I shall not want" there is I shall not lack. I'm content. And it goes on to talk about God's care for those who are his sheep, for those who have a relationship with him. He makes us lie down in green pastures. He leads us beside quiet waters. He restores our soul. He guides us in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Here we talk about contentment even in difficult times. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Here it talks about abundance. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You have anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. We have true abundance in God and knowing him. Surely goodness and loving kindness will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. That's the psalm of a contented person. Knowing God and having a relationship with him, being one of his sheep and he our shepherd, that's what contentment is all about. And so when we put these ideas together, gratitude and contentment, they anchor the heart in God, no matter what life gives or takes. Gratitude recognizes that all things are from God, all good things and we give back to God of what He has given to us. We give a return. We rightly respond to what He has given. Contentment takes what God has given, especially His love and His presence, and says, that is good enough. I don't need any more. When these two are working together, they free the heart from anxiety and comparison. If you turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. In verse 10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. If we understand Solomon to have written Ecclesiastes, you think he knew that? He says in verse 11, when good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? Notice verse 12 here. The sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much. It's talking about a content person, right? If you're a working person, if you put your trust in the Lord, your sleep is pleasant, whether you eat little or much. It's not about the circumstances. But he says, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep, because he's anxious. What if I lose this? If I put my hope in riches, if I put my hope in abundance, what happens when it's gone? What happens when the stock market crashes? What happens when the economy collapses? What happens when my house burns down? And the rich man who puts his trust in that, he's not going to sleep very much because he's thinking about all the what ifs. But in Philippians chapter 4, Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6, Paul says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything, by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. When my focus is on stuff or status or whatever else except from God, if I have it, I'm anxious that I'm going to lose it. If I don't have it, I'm envious and I'm comparing my life with everybody else. What do they have that I don't have? But when you have gratitude and contentment, the peace of God which surpasses comprehension will guard your hearts and your minds. And they produce stability in changing circumstances. In Psalm 16, Psalm 16, in verse 7. Now typically we think of this psalm as talking about Jesus in verse 10, but recently in an invitation I said, really, this is for all righteous people too. The promises that were given to Jesus are given to us through Him. And so look at verse 7. I will bless the Lord who has counseled me. Indeed, my mind instructs me in the night. I have set the Lord continually before me. Because He is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Verse 9, therefore my heart is glad and my glory rejoices. My flesh also will dwell securely. If I have God, there's no variation or shadow of turning with Him, according to James. I can dwell securely because He's not going anywhere. He will never desert us. He will never forsake us. I dwell securely with Him. In Psalm 112, Psalm 112, verse 5. Notice generosity here. The opposite of greed and ingratitude and discontentment. Verse 5, it is well with the man who is gracious and lends. He will maintain his cause in judgment, for he will never be shaken. The righteous will be remembered forever. He will not fear evil tidings. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. Again, speaking of the stability that we have in God, our hearts are upheld according to verse 8. We don't fear evil tidings. And that's not to say we don't ever have bad things happen to us, but we don't fear them. Our hearts are anchored in God Himself. And nothing can take that away from us. Consider Job. In Job chapter 1. Job is a righteous man, blameless before God. And yet, Satan decides to test him. And God allows this for the purpose of making Job even stronger, for proving his character. But after Satan has first tested him by basically taking away all his possession, even his sons and daughters, after he's heard all that news in verse 21, he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. How can Job say that after all his possessions, his own sons and his daughters are taken away from him? Because he recognizes it was from God in the first place. Number one, that all those things were from God. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb. God supplied all these things. And so even if I return naked, that's the Lord's will. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. But Job's happiness, Job's true joy is not in these things, even in his own sons and daughters, but his true joy is in the Lord. That's why he's able to say, blessed be the name of the Lord. And then over in chapter 2, after his own health is taken away from him, and even his wife is turned away, at least temporarily. In verse 7, then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. And he took a potsherd to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Now, one thing we should mention is, why did Satan do this to begin with? We're told in Job chapter 1 of this conversation between Job and God, where Satan says, after God says, have you considered my servant Job? Remember what Satan says? He basically says, Job only serves you because you blessed him. Because you put up a hedge around him, nothing bad ever happens to him. Of course he's going to serve you because his life is good. And one point of the whole book of Job is proving that's not the case. Job serves God for something bigger. And so even as his health is taken away from him, in verse 9, then his wife said to him, do you still hold fast to your integrity? Curse God and die. But he said to her, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? And all this Job did not sin with his lips. Sometimes we think gratitude and contentment is accepting the good from God. And yes, that's true. But gratitude and contentment also means accepting adversity. It means no matter what happens to me, I still am grateful and content. And yes, I understand Job struggled with that. I understand it's not easy. But that is what our relationship with God is supposed to be like. That even if difficult times come, we are still restful and secured in Him. In Habakkuk chapter 3. Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 17. Habakkuk has just been told that Judah is going to be destroyed by Babylon. And that's in part what he wanted. He wanted God to deal with the wickedness that he was seeing. But God didn't do it exactly how he thought it would happen. But notice what Habakkuk says in his prayer that seems to be put to a song at some point. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no fruit on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields produce no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls. In other words, it's all hopeless. In an agricultural culture, if you've got nothing in the field, no flocks in the stalls, you are destitute, you are doomed, you're going to die. Even if it's all hopeless, verse 18, yet I will exult in the Lord. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Even if it's all gone bad, we are anchored in God Himself. We exult, we rejoice in the Lord. And that's what gratitude and contentment is all about. God is our portion. We don't need anything else. Whatever God gives us, be it good or adversity, we accept because we know that it's from Him. And even the adversity, as we talk about in Romans 8:28 sometimes, all things work together for good for those that love the Lord, who love His appearing. What did it say about the suffering of Job? In James chapter 5 it said, Job learned that God is gracious. Even through that adversity, he understood the grace of God more perfectly when he came out on the other side. Nothing will fill you up except for God. We need to know that. We need to understand that. And if you recognize that there's always going to be something missing in your life without Jesus, then as we close here this morning, I challenge you to act on that. If you have not obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, having believed in Him, having repented of your sins, having confessed Jesus before men, and putting on Jesus Christ in baptism for the remission of your sins, if you have not done that, then you need to. And you need to do it today. Because we're not guaranteed tomorrow. Give your life to Jesus because that's the only way that you're going to have fullness in your life. True contentment. If you have put on Christ in baptism, but you have not been living with Him, you know that life leads to nothing. And it is emptiness and it is vanity, and you will never be full either. So come back to Jesus before it's too late. If you want security in your heart, and if you want to have a relationship with your God, won't you come while we stand and while we sing?